In the spring of 1981, Fay Lindqvist, a 36-year-old widow farming her dead father's rolling ground in the lowest hills of western Iowa, laid her corn out in narrow curving ribbons no wider than a wagon, half of every hillside left in sod and clover, and the men at the Soldier Valley Co-op named her the Ribbon Farmer and laughed about it for 2 full summers. They laughed right up until the sky opened over the county that July and cut every clean plowed hill for 30 miles into red gullies deep enough to lose a calf in. Every field but hers. She had done a thing an old man from the government soil office had once shown her father, a thing not one of those men had ever had the patience to keep up. Hear me about her hands first, because you would have known everything from those. They were sun-lined and large-knuckled, brown to the wrist and pale above it, the hands of a woman who had spent her life working outside in a shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. She had straight ash-blonde hair she wore pushed back off her face, and by the end of a wet day it hung plastered to her jaw. She wore a plaid work shirt going soft with washing, jeans caked stiff at the knee, rubber boots to the shin, and when the weather turned she pulled on an olive-drab surplus rain slicker that had belonged to her father before her. She was rangy and plain and steady, and there was in her face a weariness that never quite covered the quiet, stubborn thing underneath it. She read a slope as another woman reads a letter. She would walk a hillside slow, boot heel dug in, feeling for where the ground rolled its shoulder and where the water would want to run, and by the time she came back down, she knew that rise better than any map could tell it. Now, let me explain what the whole county knew for a fact in 1981. Because you have to understand the belief to understand the mockery. Everybody knew you farmed a hill fence-a-row to fence-a-row. You plowed it clean, corner to corner, every square foot of it in row crop, straight rows running up and down the slope so the tractor could go fast and turn easy at the ends. Land was money, and money was tight. And a strip of grass you did not plant was a strip you did not sell. The extension bulletins were full of terraces and tile now, big engineered dirt work paid for with borrowed money, and the young men coming up ripped out the old curving lines their fathers had left and squared everything off to plant right to the wire. A hillside half in sod was, to them, a hillside half wasted. It was money left standing in the weeds. That was the orthodoxy, and by the light of it, Fay Lindqvist had plainly gone soft in the head. The answer to why she had not was written in pencil, in a dead man's hand, in a book that lay on her kitchen table under the window. It was her father's oilcloth farm notebook, the covers gone dark and cracked at the fold, the pages inside soft as cloth. And drawn across 2 of those pages, in a neater hand than her father's, were curving lines that followed the shape of a hill, band after band of them, with a note in the margin dated a spring near the middle of the century. Her father had told her the story of it more than once. There had come a man in a government truck. In the years after the Dust Bowl had scared the whole middle of the country half to death, a soil conservation man with a hand level and a soft way of talking, and he had walked her father's hills with him for 2 days and drawn those lines. And he had left her father a rule, penciled at the bottom of the page, and her father had made her read it aloud until she knew it. Water walks slower on a curve, it said. Grass drinks what the plow lets run. She kept the old surveyor's hand level, too, a battered brass thing on a wooden tripod, and every spring she carried it out onto the hills and squinted through it and drove her stakes along the level line, exactly as she had been taught, so that her strips lay flat across the fall of the ground instead of running down it. It was slow. It was fussy. It made her neighbors laugh. But she did it every year, the same way, and she did not much care who watched. Now hear me of the man who wanted her land. His name was Orville Hasker, and he farmed the joining ground to the west, and he was not a cruel man so much as a hungry one. He had gone all in on the new way. He had bought a big moldboard plow on a note and torn his hills clean and squared them to the fence, and he ran his rows straight up and over the top like the young men did. And his corn stood thick and even, and his checks at the elevator were fat, and he was proud. He looked across the sagging wire fence at Faye's striped slope, at all that good black dirt she left growing nothing but grass, and it offended him as waste offends a hungry man. He wanted those acres. He wanted to buy them cheap off a widow who could not keep up and plow them straight and make them pay. It was Orville who gave the mockery its home at the co-op counter. He would come in of a morning, and he would tell it like a joke, how the Lindfist woman had her corn planted in ribbons like a girl braiding hair, how she mowed grass she could have been combining, and the men would laugh, and his laugh gave the room permission. "You know what she is?" he said one morning loud to the whole counter. "She's the ribbon farmer. Plants her corn in bows." And they laughed at that for 2 summers running. It stuck as a hard name sticks. Even the men who felt a twinge of shame about it used it, because a name that easy is hard to put down. His wife did not use it. Her name was Alma Hasker, and she had grown up on a hill farm herself, and she remembered the government man and the curving lines from when she was a girl. One evening she set his plate down harder than she needed to. "Orville," she said, just his name. He looked up. "That woman is doing what your own grandfather did," she said, "before you plowed his lines out. You laugh at her at that counter, and you are laughing at him. You might think on that before you open your mouth again." He did not answer her, but he thought on it, some, as a stubborn man thinks on a thing he does not want to be true. Let me stop and ask you something. Have you ever wagered everything on an idea no one else believed in? Have you ever kept doing a thing the right way, the slow, patient way your elders taught you, while a whole crowd of people who were doing it faster laughed and made money and told you that you were a fool? Then you already know the loneliness of the 2 years that came next. Stay with Faye. The Sky was keeping an appointment none of them had marked. The subsequent 2 years were a master class in patience. They were dry years, ordinary years, the kind that make a careful farmer look like a fool. There was no disaster to prove her right, only the slow arithmetic of the elevator, and in that arithmetic she came up short every fall. Orville's clean, straight hills, planted corner to corner, out-yielded her striped ones simply because he had more corn planted, and the scale ticket said so in black numbers, and there is no argument against a scale ticket down at the elevator with men listening. She farmed the curve all the same. She planted the bending strips, following the stakes, cultivating along the bow of each row while the sod bands greened between them. She mowed the grass strips and kept the grass waterways clipped so the runoff had somewhere soft to go, and it was fussy, tedious work that grew her nothing she could sell, and the men who watched her do it were sure every season that they were watching a woman farm herself slowly broke. Then the extension office made it official, and that was worse than the laughing. They sent out a young man, earnest and new, with a clipboard and a college way of talking, and he stood on her hill and told her kindly that contour strip cropping was a Dust Bowl relic. that the modern answer was engineered terraces and tile drainage, big permanent structures, and that her little grass strips were a quaint holdover from her father's day. Superseded, gone by. He wrote it down. He filed a report. And the report gave Orville and the co-op men a thing better than a joke. It gave them the government's own word that the ribbon farmer was farming the past. The banker heard about the report. He came out too, and he stood on her hill and looked at all that ground in grass and did his own arithmetic. And he told her, not unkindly either, that her sod strips read as unproductive acres against her note, collateral growing nothing, and that a woman alone had to think hard about carrying ground that did not pay. And there came a winter night that Fay Lindqvist came the closest she ever came to signing it all away. She sat at the kitchen table with the lamp on and the wind working at the window, and there were papers in front of her that Orville had sent. A fair offer for the West Acres, more than fair, enough to breathe. She had the pen in her sun-lined hand. Plow it straight, the papers said without saying it. Farm like everyone else. Stop being the joke of the county. And she sat there a long while with the pen not moving. Then she pulled the oilcloth notebook over and opened it to the 2 pages with the curving lines, and she read the government man's rule aloud in the empty kitchen, as her father had once made her read it when she was a girl. Water walks slower on a curve. Grass drinks what the plow lets run. She read the date beside it, a spring day in the 1950s, the date a dead man had knelt on that hill and drawn the shape of it true. And she set the pen down. The next morning she carried the old brass hand level out onto the hill in the cold, and she redrove every stake along the level line. And she farmed the curve 1 more year. And something was building in the July sky over western Iowa that not one man with a moldboard plow had thought to reckon with. Let me carry you to the day it came, and let me tell it from the wrong side of the fence, from Orville Hasker's side, because that is where you would have felt it in your stomach. It began as heat, a thick green stillness with no wind in it, the kind of afternoon where the birds go quiet. Then a wall of cloud came up out of the southwest, dark as a bruise, and it did not pass over as storms are meant to do. It stalled. It parked itself over the county, and it opened, and it rained in a fashion none of them had a name for, rain by the inch, sheets of it standing in the air, so much water so fast that the clean-tilled hills could not drink a drop of it. And on every straight plowed slope in the county, the water began to run. It ran as it always wants to run on bare ground laid up and down a hill. It gathered at the top of Orville's clean rows, and it ran unbroken down the open furrows, faster and faster with nothing to slow it. And where a little water had cut a little rill, the next water cut it deeper, and the rills fed ditches, and the ditches fed gullies, and Orville Hasker stood at his kitchen window and watched his hill come apart. The topsoil of a lifetime, the black dirt his grandfather had broke and his father had kept, and he had plowed clean corner to corner. Lifted up brown and roaring, and went down the slope and off to the creek in the space of one afternoon. By dusk his best hill had a raw red clay canyon torn down the middle of it deep enough to lose a calf in, and the water in the ditch below ran the color of blood. He walked out in it at last light, in the letting up rain, and he came to the sagging wire fence at the west line. And he looked across it, and what he saw there he would carry to the end of his days. Fay Lindqvist's whole striped slope stood green. Her corn was up and holding, her curving bands of it climbed the hill unbroken, and between every few rows of corn a band of sod and clover lay dark and soaked and whole, and the hill under all of it had not moved. There was no gully, there was no red clay wound. At the foot of her slope, the grassed waterway ran full, and the water coming off her hill and going into the creek ran nearly clear. 30 miles of the county had bled its topsoil to the bottoms that afternoon, and here, across one sagging fence, was one whole green hill that had not lost a spoonful. And there she was on the crest of it in the last of the rain. A rangy woman in an olive-drab slicker with the hood up and her ash-blonde hair plastered wet to her jaw. One gloved hand resting on the green corn. Her eyes not on Orville and not on any watching man, but down the slope, on the water, reading it as she read everything. Now let me explain what he was looking at, because this is the thing that was written in the notebook all along, the thing they were never told. A bare-plowed row running down a hill is a chute. That is all it is. The rain that falls on it has nowhere to go but down, and it runs the whole length of the slope without ever being stopped, and running water gathers speed. And water with speed in it has teeth, and it cuts. That is why every clean hill in the county opened up like a wound. But a contour strip does two things at once. It lays the crop across the level line, so the rows themselves hold water instead of draining it. And it sets a band of tough sod every few rods straight across the fall of the water, so that the sheet of rain coming down the hill runs only a little way before it hits grass. And grass catches water. Grass slows it and spreads it thin and drinks it down into its roots, and then hands what is left, gentle and slow, to the next strip below. The water never gets to run far enough or fast enough on Faye's Hill to grow any teeth. It walks. It does not run. It was never magic, and it was never luck. It was water made to walk instead of run, one grass strip at a time, the whole length of a hill, exactly as an old man had drawn it out 30 years before, with a hand level and a pencil. She did not go to the co-op the next morning to say a word. There is no scene in this story where Fay Lindqvist stands at that counter and tells the men what they can do with their straight rows. She fed her stock, and she walked her hill, and she looked at the water still running clear off the foot of it. The one who crossed the fence first was a boy, or near enough, a young man of about 19, Orville's own son. And he came up her lane in the morning with his cap held against his chest. "Ma'am," he said, and stopped and started again. "My father didn't send me. He doesn't know I'm here." He turned his cap in his hands. "I stood on our hill this morning, and there's a canyon in it now. And I looked at yours, and it's whole, and I need to know how. I need you to show me how to lay our hills out on the curve the same as yours, before the next rain finds what's left." He swallowed. "How? How did you know?" She looked at him a while. Then she said only, "Come on, then." And she went in and got the notebook and the old brass level, and she walked him down the hill. Orville came himself before the week was out. He stood at her lane a long time before he came up it, and when he did his hat was off, and he did not make it a joke, and there was no laugh left in him to give the counter. "I was wrong," he said. "I was wrong for 2 years, and I laughed, and I plowed my grandfather's lines out to spite the past, and I lost a hill for it that I will not live to see grow back. You were doing what he did all along. I called you the ribbon farmer. I stood down at the co-op, and I made it a joke, and every man there laughed because I gave them leave to. Will you show me anyway?" She put out her sun-lined hand, and he took it, and that was the whole of it. No gloating, just a widow and a humbled man shaking hands over a wire fence in the mud. She did more than show him. She carried the brass hand level onto his ruined hill herself, and she sighted the level line across it and drove his first stakes with her own hands, kneeling in the raw clay where his topsoil used to be, laying the shape of the contour back onto a slope that a man had spent good money to make straight. Now let me show you how it ended, because it did not end at the fence. The Extension Service came back, and this time they came with a purpose. The earnest young man who had filed the report brought an older man with him, and they measured. They measured the soil Fay Lindqvist had kept against the soil the county had lost, and the numbers were not close. Where the clean hills had bled their black dirt to the creek by the inch, her strips had held it near whole. And the older man, who was old enough to remember the government trucks, took off his hat on her hill. They wrote it up. They filed her farm as the district's contour strip cropping demonstration plot, and they gave the folk practice its right name, the name the Soil Conservation Service had carried since the Dust Bowl days. And they held a field day on it that fall. They held that field day of all the ground in the county on the very hill the co-op men had laughed at. They stood the neighbors in her clover strips and walked them up her whole green slope and showed them the waterway running clear, and they put it in the county bulletin, and in that bulletin, printed plain for anyone to read, they credited a soil conservation man long dead, whose curving lines, drawn in a young farmer's oilcloth notebook in the 1950s, had, 30 years on, saved the only whole hill in the county. His name went into the permanent record. He would never know it. But it was written down where a dead man's good work belongs, which is where it can go on working after him. And Fay Lindqvist went home from that field day and set her father's notebook back on the kitchen table under the window, and she kept writing in it, rainfall and stake lines and the date she mowed the sod bands, in her own sun-lined hand now, below the government man's, below her father's, the three of them writing on the same pages across 30 years. The hill stayed, the topsoil stayed, and somewhere down the years there would be another set of hands to open that book and read the rule aloud, as she had, as her own father, had once made her do. They saw a patchwork waste of good ground. She saw the shape of the water and the memory of a wiser man. And when the sky finally came to settle the argument, the hill remembered which of them had been right.